Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we're delving into the infamous events that halted the hustle and bustle of everyday life and made the world stand still. And we're starting with the human errors that cost the world dearly.
Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we're counting down our picks for the most consequential mistakes in history.
Even 20 minutes after the disaster, the controllers in the tower still have no idea how serious things are.
Number 10, the 2024 CrowdStrike incident.
It's hit transport, with air passengers and their luggage having to be manually processed, delaying flights. Trains have also been affected.
Before July 19, 2024, few people had ever heard of CrowdStrike. It's amazing how much damage just one day can do. CrowdStrike is a cybersecurity company based out of Austin, Texas, that caused about $10 billion in damage on the morning of July 19th. CrowdStrike made an update to its Falcon sensor software, but a bug caused the software to crash.
Officials in Europe were already getting a grasp on how bad the issue was. Germany's cybersecurity chief warned people it would be a long day.
Systems running Microsoft Windows crashed, resulting in the largest outage in world history. The results were devastating and disrupted nearly all aspects of daily life, upending banks, hospitals, air transport, and retail. It just goes to show how fragile our tech-heavy existence truly is.
Ambulance services across the country have reported a surge in demand as a result.
But if you have an urgent problem, you should contact your own GP surgery, either in person or by telephone.
Number 9, Pickett's charge.
March!
Confederate General Robert E. Lee made the biggest mistake of his life on July 3, 1863, when he ordered his troops to charge on Cemetery Ridge. There were several flaws in Lee's plan. Union General George G. Meade had anticipated Lee's attack on the center of his lines rather than the flanks, and concentrated his defenses there.
Now Pickett gave the order. Up, men, and to your posts. Don't forget today that you are from Old Virginia.
The charge exposed Confederate soldiers to heavy artillery and rifle fire, and the Army suffered catastrophic casualties. It effectively crippled the Confederate forces at Gettysburg and forced Lee to abandon the battle and retreat from the North. With this one simple change, the tide of the American Civil War permanently shifted, all to the detriment of Lee and his forces.
What's happening? I can't see what's happening to my boys. What's happening to my boys?
Number 8, the Cedar Fire.
It's gigantic. You never imagine it's as big as that until it happens.
Imagine accidentally starting a fire that burns over 270,000 acres of land and kills 15 people. The guilt would be unimaginable. Sergio Martinez was a novice hunter who got lost in the Cuyamaca Mountains of Southern California in October 2003 and started a fire to signal potential rescuers.
Afraid he was going to die in the wilderness, he finally set a signal fire, which got out of control.
But the flames quickly spread to the nearby Chaparral, and he lost control of the fire. The low humidity and Santa Ana winds exacerbated the destruction, and the fire burned through 273,000 acres of San Diego County. Nearly 3,000 buildings were destroyed, and 15 people lost their lives. Martinez was given 5 years probation and 960 hours of community service.
If you take a look down Fairbrook here, Fairbrook Place, this is just something you'd probably see in a movie. That's the only way to describe it.
Number 7, Germany invades Russia.
In the summer of 1941, Hitler orders a surprise invasion of the Soviet Union, catching his ally completely off guard.
Back in 1812, Napoleon tried invading Russia. It didn't work. Like, it really didn't work. Over 100 years later, Hitler made the same mistake, and to equally devastating results. The entire world watched with bated breath as Nazi Germany invaded Russia in Operation Barbarossa.
Join your German comrades. They understand your suffering and will care more for you than your own officers.
It was a catastrophic military blunder, owing mainly to insurmountable Soviet strength, the vastness of the territory, and the brutal winter conditions that crippled German forces. Despite having the largest invasion force in the history of warfare, Operation Barbarossa was a monumental failure. The Soviets successfully repelled the Germans, leading to massive casualties and ultimately turning the tide of World War II, and for that matter, the entire 20th century.
If Hitler wants a war, Stalin will give him one.
Number 6. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill.
126 people were on board at the time of the explosion.
Some jumped more than 75 feet into the ocean.
A multitude of factors went into the Deepwater Horizon explosion and oil spill. A central mistake was the failure to correctly respond to the signs of impending disaster. Pressure tests indicated that the well was not properly sealed, but the readings were misinterpreted.
Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Deepwater Horizon. It's on fire. We've had a major explosion. We need assistance. It's on fire!
This error was compounded by a rush to complete the drilling operation, driven largely by cost-cutting pressures, leading to the decision to proceed with the operation despite warning signs. The sequence of failures ultimately triggered the calamitous explosion that killed 11 people and sent 210 million gallons of oil into the Gulf of Mexico.
Meanwhile, live cameras on the ocean floor show the ferocity of the ongoing leak.
Number 5. The Exxon Valdez oil spill.
They were completely overwhelmed. Coast Guard didn't quite know what to do.
Before Deepwater Horizon, the Exxon Valdez oil spill was the largest in American history, dumping more than 10 million gallons into Alaska's Prince William Sound. But this accident was far less complex and is attributed almost entirely to human error. Shortly after midnight on March 24, 1989, the tanker ran aground on Bligh Reef, puncturing 8 of its 11 cargo holds.
When we got on the radio, he said, "Well, how big's the hole?" I said, "Well, it's big enough to drive our boat through."
At the time, Captain Joe Hazelwood was below decks, sleeping off, quote, 2 or 3 vodkas he had consumed earlier. Furthermore, the crew was overworked and exhausted, contributing to third mate Gregory Cousins driving the vessel into the reef. Part of the blame also reportedly lay on the Exxon Shipping Company for failing to maintain the ship's collision avoidance system.
You can see oil like a boiling cauldron.
Number 4. The Tenerife Airport disaster.
Look at it out there. I mean, this cloud just rolled right onto us. I don't think anybody has the minimums now.
This disaster on Spain's Canary Islands in March 1977 remains the deadliest accident in aviation history, costing 583 lives. Los Rodeos Airport was congested due to a bomb explosion at Gran Canaria. Exacerbating this was a dense fog rolling into the airport. KLM Flight 4805 took off in the fog and crashed into Pan Am Flight 1736, which was still taxiing on the runway.
It feels great to be alive. I'd be lying if I said anything else.
An investigation found that the accident resulted from critical miscommunication between KLM Captain Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten and air traffic control. Ambiguous and non-standard wording led Veldhuizen van Zanten to commence takeoff without proper clearance, resulting in the tragic collision.
When I got out on the ground, I could hear people screaming and yelling and all. Within about 5 minutes, you heard absolutely nothing. There was no noise at all.
Number 3. Space Shuttle Challenger disaster.
As recorded on E-207 and E-204, the first visual indication that the anomalous plume penetrated the external tank was seen at 64.66 seconds as an abrupt change in the shape and color of the plume.
Roughly 40 million people tuned in to watch NASA's Challenger launch into space in 1986. Unfortunately, the launch was plagued by freezing temperatures. Engineers were worried that the cold could compromise the integrity of the O-ring seals in the shuttle's solid rocket boosters. The cold made the rubber less resilient, leading to a weakened seal which could allow hot gas to escape the booster.
We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. Flight director confirms that. We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point.
Engineers at SRB manufacturer Morton Thiokol recommended against launching, but after internal discussion, management gave the go-ahead. Challenger launched, and the O-ring failed just as predicted, causing the shuttle to break apart and killing all 7 crew members.
My job began just at the time that this tragic accident occurred, and I was not permitted to have emotional feelings about it.
Number 2, the sinking of the Titanic.
What did you see?
Iceberg, dead ahead, sir.
Numerous factors went into the sinking of the Titanic. The crew were warned of icebergs in the vicinity several times that fateful day on April 14, 1912, but these warnings were largely ignored. Not only that, but the Titanic was traveling at a reckless speed of 22.5 knots through the area, relying solely on the crow's nest to spot impending obstacles.
Why are they turning? Is it hard over? It is, yes, sir, hard over.
This was done mainly to bolster public image, as Atlantic liners had a reputation for being fast and on time. As a result, ships often traveled at full speed and treated warnings as mere advisories. But in this case, the iceberg was spotted too late, and the ship was going too fast to avoid it. Roughly 1,500 people lost their lives. Number 1. The Chernobyl disaster.
At long last we have arrived. 1:23:45. Explosion.
As anyone who watched the masterful HBO show would know, Chernobyl was an accident waiting to happen. And happen it did on the morning of April 26, 1986. The nuclear plant was ironically running a safety test and pushing the reactor to its limits. Unfortunately, operator errors and inadequate safety protocols caused a catastrophic surge in power inside of the reactor.
No one in the room that night knew the shutdown button could act as a detonator.
This, combined with cheap building materials, led to a massive steam explosion, which ruptured the reactor vessel and released a substantial amount of radiation into the atmosphere. The disaster cost untold lives, damaged the surrounding area, and cost hundreds of billions of dollars, making it the costliest disaster in human history.
And one big problem which Western scientists see in Soviet plants is the lack of a containment building. When all else fails, there's no outer shell to hold the radioactivity in.
Do you remember where you were when you heard about these?
The 90s was a decade that gave us plenty of technological advancements, historical milestones, culture shifts, and it also provided events that captured global attention. Take a look.
I'd like to begin by saying how sorry I am about what happened to Nancy Kerrigan.
Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we're counting down our picks for those unexpected and notable moments from the 90s that left our mouths ajar with nothing to say.
This was a tragedy that the entire country got to watch in real time.
Number 10, Tyson bites ear.
So we go back in, then all of a sudden, you bit this ear, and I wasn't the same one?
Boxing fans expect a lot of things. They expect to see guys punch each other. They expect guys to get hurt, tired, maybe even a little bloody. But until 1997, they never expected to see one guy bite off a piece of the other guy's ear. That's exactly what happened, though, in the third round of the Evander Holyfield versus Mike Tyson fight on June 28th of that year.
Bit his ear, I can see the bite mark.
Okay. He bit his ear, he's out. Telling Mark Rat.
2-point deduction, the fight will go on.
Tyson, frustrated with Holyfield's headbutting, chomped off a piece of his right ear and spit it out. Later in the round, he bit the left ear. And talk about the unexpected, this moment came 7 years after Tyson had shocked the world in 1990, getting himself knocked out by the 42-1 underdog, Buster Douglas.
Oh, nice uppercut by Buster Douglas! Look at that! He's knocked Mike Tyson down!
Number 9, the death of Kurt Cobain.
Cobain, Love said, had grown weary of career pressures and was unhappy with Nirvana.
As a founder of the band Nirvana, a father of the grunge music scene, and one of the most important and influential voices of his generation, Kurt Cobain said a lot with his music. And yet, his death via a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head on April 5th, 1994, left us all speechless.
You can think about him as one story of rock and roll, right?
Yeah.
Of the youth that burns out way too early. We've had too many like that.
Since his passing, though, it seems like everyone has had something to say about Cobain and various conspiracy theories regarding his passing. But for that one moment, there were really no words for the shock that came with the news that the world had lost an icon. We also can't forget the shocking death of another music icon 2 years later, when Tupac Shakur was gunned down in Las Vegas.
So if there is an accomplice that helped commit this murder, they still are looking for that person.
Number 8, the death of Princess Diana.
Diana, Princess of Wales,
has in fact been killed in that car accident in Paris.
There have been many shocking deaths throughout history, but few deaths shocked the entire world more than that of Princess Diana on August 31st, 1997. Diana was beloved around the globe, and the report of the Paris car crash that put her in the hospital was breaking news that evening, and pretty much all everyone was talking about for days to follow.
The world is in shock. Diana, Princess of Wales, is dead, and Britain is in mourning.
The outpouring of sadness around the world cannot truly be understood if you weren't around at that time. But the fact that 2.5 billion people watched her funeral live on television on September 6th indicates the impact of her passing.
Each time I drive through this tunnel, each time I come and I walk here, it's still quite vivid, and the memory, the image are printed in my memory.
Number 7. Ayrton Senna's crash.
There's only one word that describes Ayrton's style, and that is fast.
3 years before the car crash that took the life of Princess Diana, another car crash left people speechless, especially fans of Formula One racing. On May 1st, 1994, Ayrton Senna was leading the San Marino Grand Prix when, on lap 7, his car ran off the track and hit a concrete barrier at 131 miles per hour.
Even at racing speed, Tamburello is not a corner that you would make a mistake on. Something on the car would have to go wrong.
Senna died on the scene. The day before, another driver, Roland Ratzenberger, had crashed and died during the qualifying run. And while those accidents were shocking and tragic, Senna's death did lead Formula One to create a series of new safety protocols to better protect their drivers.
Maybe the power steering failed. Maybe it was the tire temperatures that made the car skate straight off the road. It will always be a mystery.
Number 6. O.J. Simpson is found not guilty.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant, Orenthal James Simpson, not guilty of the crime of murder.
There are few moments in history that are so big that everyone remembers where they were when it happened. The O.J. Simpson verdict is one of those moments. If we're being honest, the entire O.J. case is one of those moments. From the low-speed chase in the white Bronco, watched by 95 million people, to the trial itself and the aforementioned verdict.
Are they in order?
Yes, Your Honor.
You have signed and dated those verdict forms?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you very much.
The O.J. Simpson murder case took over our lives from June of 1994 until the verdict in October of 1995. It felt like everyone had an opinion about the case, the evidence, and Simpson's guilt. And 57% of the country, 150 million people, found themselves in front of a television on October 3rd, 1995 to witness the verdict live.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant, Orenthal James Simpson, not guilty.
Number 5. Bosnian War.
Chilling words from the man they called the Butcher of Bosnia, General Ratko Mladic. The snide humor masked his killer instinct.
Rather than just one moment, this is an event that left us speechless for 3 years as this horrible and brutal war raged on between 1992 and 1995 in the then region of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Moments of violence, destruction, and ethnic cleansing had the rest of the world looking on in horror.
You just can't imagine that tomorrow someone will bomb you or shoot at you.
In the end, over 60 people were convicted of war crimes, and more than 100,000 people lost their lives, with 2.2 million more finding themselves displaced. It was the most disastrous conflict Europe had experienced since the end of World War II.
Psychotherapist Selma Bacevac is a Bosnian refugee who uses her experience to help other survivors heal from the long-term trauma of the war.
Number 4. Operation Desert Storm.
You get 4 to 6 Hellfires en route. The time of flight's about 12 seconds. And then all of a sudden they start hitting.
Operation Desert Storm was the second part of the Gulf War, which took place between 1990 and 1991. Part 1, known as Operation Desert Shield, began in August of 1990 and involved the buildup of military forces by the American-led coalition following Iraq's invasion and occupation of Kuwait.
Every war is different.
Every war is the same.
Phase 2, Operation Desert Storm, was the use of all that military might, starting with massive aerial bombings on January 17, 1991. Bombing that we all watched live, every day on the news. On February 24th, the ground war began, and 100 hours later, the war was over and Kuwait was liberated.
And all the jarheads, killing and dying, they will always be me.
Number 3, Waco Siege.
The raid was unsuccessful.
And then all hell broke loose. Just bullets flying into the building, going through the wall.
On February 28, 1993, the ATF had planned on raiding the ranch in Waco, Texas that was home to the Branch Davidians' religious cult. They suspected the Davidians of stockpiling illegal weapons and planned a surprise raid to serve their search warrants.
If we come out of that compound with a bunch of innocent kids and loaded guns, it might remind Congress why they need us.
Well, through a series of events, the group was warned in advance and were armed and ready when the ATF showed up. What followed was a 51-day siege that ended on April 19th when the Davidians set the compound on fire in response to the FBI throwing in tear gas. In the end, the loss of life included 4 federal agents and 82 Branch Davidians.
For me, the culprit of Waco, even after 30 years of looking at this, is clearly David Koresh.
Number 2, Rodney King beating, LA riots.
30 years ago today, Rodney King was beaten by LAPD officers. That attack captured on video for all to see.
With the advent of smartphones, footage of black men being the victims of police brutality has become all too common. But it's been going on for a lot longer than that, and the 1990s was no exception. When video footage of Rodney King being beaten by 4 police officers hit the news, it hit us all right in the guts.
LAPD gonna have a real good time on that level 3 prison yard, you know what I'm saying?
To see him lying on the ground as the officers kicked, stomped, clubbed, and stunned him was, and still is, so hard to watch. But as speechless as that left us all, when the officers were acquitted by a jury, many black residents of Los Angeles couldn't keep quiet any longer. And for 6 days, LA was on fire, literally and metaphorically.
We're looking at you and in South Central, Linda, where you are. Are the television cameras making these people do some of these things they wouldn't otherwise be doing?
Number 1, Oklahoma City attack. On April 19th, 1993, the 51-day Waco siege ended. On April 19th, 1995, a truck bomb blew up the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. That date wasn't a coincidence. Timothy McVeigh picked it because his attack was set in motion by the siege at Waco and what he saw as the government's growing control and regulations on private citizens.
Why someone would do something of this magnitude, it's unreal.
Especially when it came to guns. The bombing was, and still is, the deadliest act of domestic terrorism the United States has ever seen. And those who saw it, whether in person or on television, were no doubt left speechless in sadness.
It was the worst terrorist act in American history, and Timothy McVeigh could now be sentenced to death.
Which of these moments left you the most speechless?
They're cowardly. They're unspeakably shameless.
All right, we're now going to dig into the moments that urged us to rethink the consequences of human action. Here now are man-made disasters that shook our world.
It's almost certainly the most severe accident that has ever taken place in the short history of civilian nuclear power.
Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we're looking at the most devastating disasters caused by human error that shocked people around the world.
On the evening of the third day, the smog was at its very worst.
The Aberfan disaster, Aberfan, Wales. Keeping home and business close can sometimes lead to horrific consequences. The village of Aberfan learned this firsthand in 1966.
In 1966, the coal industry was still booming in South Wales. The local colliery had been dumping waste onto Mynydd Merthyr above the village of Aberfan for some time.
The residential area is located at the bottom of a hill containing several piles of waste accumulated during mining. Although the material is sensitive to water, the National Coal Board knowingly constructed them over the site of a natural spring. That waterway, combined with weeks of rain, caused it to break loose and careen toward Aberfan.
And on the morning of the 21st, the subsidence caused that slurry to come crashing down like an avalanche into the village.
Besides destroying homes, it hit a school, leading to the deaths of 5 teachers and over 100 students. The NCB was eventually found to be at fault, although none of its board members faced any repercussions.
That this tragedy was, in fact, avoidable, with the blame resting entirely on the National Coal Board.
Shockingly, they even attempted to offer victims a mere £50 each. Centralia Fire, Centralia, United States of America. While some human-caused catastrophes last a few days and are eventually resolved, others have been ongoing for decades, with no end in sight.
It all began back in May 1962, when local officials unwittingly sparked an underground fire.
Up until 1962, Centralia was a normal town in Pennsylvania. That year, officials decided that the best way to clear out a strip mine turned landfill was by burning it, a practice that had been outlawed.
No one knows for sure how the blaze reached the coal, but it's possible that the pit hadn't been properly lined before the fire. As the trash burned, the townsfolk didn't realize it had ignited the coal beneath it.
Nevertheless, they ignored the law and started the fire on May 27th, and it has been burning ever since. It had near immediate effects, creating sinkholes and high levels of carbon monoxide, leading to severe health problems. By 1992, Centralia had been condemned, and most of its citizens bought out.
Centralia, it was just finally a matter of money. What's going to cost more to dig this huge barrier and surround the coal, or just buy everybody out? And so they decided to buy everybody out as a cheaper alternative.
However, you can still visit today and see the steam rising from the 60-year-old blaze. Minamata disease, Minamata, Japan. This is truly the stuff of nightmares. For decades, the Chiso Corporation in Minamata, Japan, dumped water treated with heavy metals like mercury and lead into local waterways.
And researchers soon worked out that the contamination was coming from the fish, their flesh full of mercury. But it took months before it was traced back to a chemical plant run by the chemical giant Chiso, which since 1951 had been discharging a derivative of mercury into the bay.
Not only did this harm native fish, it also had a direct impact on those eating them, humans included. It wasn't until a child fell ill in 1956 that people even realized they'd been eating contaminated food.
Many people had fallen ill, all in this area. There was a great deal of concern that it was contagious.
The girl's symptoms, ranging from difficulty speaking to convulsions, began to appear in others. This neurological disorder, eventually named Minamata disease, afflicted thousands of people, with nearly 2,500 individuals officially diagnosed by 2001. Nearly a decade after the discovery in Minamata, a similar outbreak occurred in Niigata, another Japanese region, due to pollution from an electrical company.
I would like the whole world to understand the dangers of pollution. We humans should never make the same mistake again. Not ever.
Gulf War oil spill, Persian Gulf. War has caused some truly brutal acts to be committed throughout history, and this is by far one of the most senseless.
Saddam's latest terror weapon assaulted the beaches of Saudi Arabia today. Saudi officials call it a catastrophe. It is already history's largest oil spill.
During the 1991 Gulf War, things escalated to a point no one saw coming. In an attempt to prevent United States troops from invading, Saddam Hussein allegedly ordered a massive, continuous oil spill into the Persian Gulf. It lasted for a week, with thousands of tons being dumped daily.
The first victims of the disaster struggling to free themselves from its grip.
It coated the feathers of marine birds, leading to an estimated 30,000 perishing. A 1993 study claiming the long-term environmental impact would be insignificant has sparked continuous debates since. Considered one of the first real acts of eco-terrorism, this has remained one of the largest leaks in human history.
The Sierra Club, for instance, said the dumping could destroy the Gulf for decades, limiting fishing and the food supply. And if it spread far enough down the Gulf, the oil could clog desalination plants that supply most of the region's drinking water.
Montana asbestos cloud. Libby, United States of America. At one point, their resources made them an epicenter of mining. But that prosperity came with unforeseen circumstances.
Libby got news of one of the worst environmental bombshells in Northwest history. Widespread asbestos contamination from years of vermiculite extraction at the W.R. Grace mine.
Libby, Montana used to be the source of 80% of the world's supply of vermiculite, a mineral that's utilized in heating and insulation. What the citizens weren't aware of is that it contained asbestos, small fibers that wreak havoc on the lungs. The firm, W.R. Grace & Company, were allegedly aware of this, but still sent workers into the mines daily.
Hundreds of workers contracted lung cancer and other diseases from working at the mine, which was contaminated with asbestos.
As a result, both laborers and the residents were exposed, causing nearly 10% of the population to die. By 2009, the government stepped in to provide over $100 million in aid and prosecute the company. However, they were acquitted soon afterwards.
The end of the active cleanup operations is a success, but one mixed with an economic impact.
Exxon Valdez oil spill, Prince William Sound, Alaska. While accidents are unintentional by default, not all are defensible. In 1989, the tanker Exxon Valdez was transporting oil from Alaska when the unimaginable happened.
One of the worst oil spills in U.S. history brought Americans images of blackened beaches, dying wildlife, outrage, and betrayal.
During the shipping process, only one officer was left on the bridge, a direct violation of company policy. He was unable to change courses and made direct contact with a nearby reef. Nearly 6 million gallons of oil spilled within the first few hours.
Neither Exxon nor Alyeska, the oil pipeline company in charge of the immediate response, was ready for such a large spill.
Alyeska was supposed to have an emergency response team at its terminal in Valdez, but 8 years ago the team was disbanded.
The cleanup alone was disastrous, causing employees and volunteers to fall ill. The environmental impact was even greater, with hundreds of thousands of animals dying. Blame was heaped on the captain of the tanker, who was allegedly intoxicated at the time, and he was eventually convicted of a misdemeanor.
Today, not only is it no longer the largest, but there are more than 50 spills worldwide that have surpassed what happened here.
Great Smog of London, London, England. By the 1950s, many cities had fully embraced industrialization, and London was no exception.
It started on the 5th of December. Fog laid a blanket over the London area.
The cold weather at the time led to an increased amount of coal being burned, with residents relying on a lesser quality version high in sulfur dioxide. In 1952, an anticyclone and a lack of wind caused the city's pollutants to be trapped in the air, which severely reduced visibility and triggered intense respiratory issues.
Quite a number of people had bronchitis because of industrial pollution exposure and because they smoked. When they breathed polluted air, this became very hard for them.
The smog remained for 4 days before a breeze finally rolled through and broke it. Initially, it was reported that around 4,000 people died, but modern estimates put the death toll at approximately 12,000. This disaster was so severe that it prompted the British Parliament to enact the Clean Air Act of 1956.
We still had smog, but as time went on, we had the availability of smokeless fuels like natural gas, like oil. Without that, we'd have been in a bad way.
Bhopal disaster, Bhopal, India. Some chemicals that were created to be helpful have devastating effects on our health.
The scenes are simply hellish. So much suffering from India's invisible killer. At one point, an official said one death was being recorded every minute from the poison gas leak in the city of Bhopal.
In 1984, the citizens of Bhopal learned this firsthand when several avoidable factors, like malfunctioning safety equipment and clogged pipes, caused one of the worst chemical disasters in history. Union Carbide India Limited, a U.S.-owned factory, accidentally leaked highly toxic methyl isocyanate into the air and surrounding neighborhoods.
At 74, she is bent but hardly broken by what she has seen. She tries to comfort by listening. These men saying, "We can hardly see anymore."
Most residents were asleep at the time, giving them no chance to evacuate. Over 500,000 people were impacted, with nearly a third being children. The death toll skyrocketed, and survivors endured physical, neurological, and emotional scars. Ultimately, the company was held accountable and ordered to pay $470 million to those affected in 1989. BP Deepwater oil spill, Gulf of Mexico. Although it may be the most recent oil spill on this list, it's by far one of the worst.
The U.S. Coast Guard received a mayday from the bridge and flashed this distress call.
The Deepwater Horizon on fire, with all persons off the vessel but persons in the water.
BP's tanker Deepwater Horizon was supposed to have a mechanism in place to prevent methane gas from getting through the pipes, but those valves failed. This caused the gas to rise into the drilling rig, triggering a massive explosion that killed 11 workers. This was just the beginning.
BP had an opportunity to explain to the American people, and quite frankly, they blew it. He was going to do whatever he could to protect the company.
An estimated 210 million gallons of oil then leaked, destroying whole ecosystems in the process. The spill had disastrous effects on local marine life, with some species mutating to have gaping sores and no eyes.
Money from the Restore Act is now making its way to coastal communities to help restore the Gulf.
In 2011, BP was officially blamed, but despite several criminal charges, none of those involved received any prison time. Chernobyl disaster, Pripyat, Ukraine. When most people think of easily preventable tragedies, this one often comes to mind, and it's clear to see why.
They wanted to see whether the reactor could still be cooled if the plant lost power. But they violated safety protocols, and several power surges occurred inside the reactor.
In April 1986, operators at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine attempted an experiment to cool the reactor to test its performance during an emergency. A combination of an accidental power dip and a design flaw within the machine resulted in an unexpected power surge.
But the fact that they've had to reveal it and admit that there are casualties suggests they're deeply worried about the scale of it.
This caused a giant meltdown, releasing radiation into the air. It took hours and dozens falling ill before an evacuation was called. The environmental impact was immense, with several trees dying and several animal species losing the ability to reproduce. The cleanup is expected to last until 2065, meaning until then, the effects could become even worse.
Radiation is still leaking. Efforts to contain the contamination began back in 1997, when the Chernobyl Shelter Fund was established. The idea? Shield the entire reactor under a concrete dome.
Which disaster perpetrated by humans do you think will have the biggest long-term impact?
All right, we're going to end things today with the ultimate list of moments that shaped our world in ways that we still feel today. What do you think tops that list? Something that we've already seen? Perhaps something different? Let's find out.
May 8th, 1945 is declared Victory in Europe Day. Spontaneous celebrations erupt throughout the world.
Welcome to WatchMojo, and today we're counting down our picks for shocking events in modern history that made just about everyone stop and take notice.
What a moment. Man on the way to the moon.
Number 30, the Israel-Hamas War. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been ongoing for 3/4 of a century, with the 2023 Israel-Hamas war adding another tragic and bloody chapter.
There are so many families across Israel asking, where was the army? Why didn't they stop this? What do you tell those families?
I tell them it's the responsibility of the army. It's the responsibility of the army for the intelligence. It's our responsibility to guard the people of Israel. We failed on Saturday. This is our responsibility, but now we're fighting.
This latest conflict began when the Palestinian political and militant group Hamas launched a surprise attack on the 7th of October 2023, killing around 1,200 Israelis, mostly civilians. They also took 250 Israelis hostage, demanding the release of Palestinian prisoners.
This is a massive terrorist attack that is gunning down Israeli civilians in their towns, in their homes, and as we've seen so graphically, literally dragging people across the border with Gaza.
In retaliation, Israel dropped 6,000 bombs on Gaza over 6 days and launched a ground invasion. Over 17,000 Palestinians have been killed, 7,000 of them children. There have been widespread global protests, and Gaza has collapsed into a humanitarian crisis. Number 29, the Tiananmen Square protests and massacre. In China, references to this event, also known as the June 4th incident, are heavily censored. In the spring of 1989, student-led demonstrations were held in Tiananmen Square, Beijing, calling for democracy and greater civil liberties.
They turned Tiananmen Square, the country's symbol of sovereignty, into a hub of dissent and protest.
They want a crackdown on corruption. They want freedom of press. They call for an awakening to reform and progress in China.
The protests spread to hundreds of cities, with workers joining them, angry over inflation, corruption, and the erosion of welfare. Declaring martial law, the government sent soldiers and tanks into the square. The death toll is disputed, ranging from hundreds to thousands.
Estimates run from several hundred to over 10,000. Some argue that by shooting at civilians, the Communist Party lost its legitimacy to rule, and with it, an opportunity for political modernization.
Famously, at least outside of China, the photo of an unknown man facing off against a column of tanks has become an enduring symbol of the event. Today, public displays of mourning for the victims are banned, although commemorations still sometimes reportedly occur in secret. Number 28, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Also known as the BP oil spill, this unfortunately wasn't the first industrial disaster to devastate our marine habitats, but it remains the largest on record. It began on April 20th, due to an explosion on the Deepwater Horizon oil platform.
And there's 30,000 of these workers every day that go on the Gulf to do this work, and they're well trained, but and they work to try to not have these accidents. But on this day, something went wrong, and now we're working with BP and we're Transocean to try to find the cause.
The fallout from this disaster resulted in 205 million gallons of oil discharged into the Gulf of Mexico, and effects were still being felt years after the initial disaster.
Birds are still on these islands coming in here feeding. So you can just imagine the contamination that takes place within the wildlife.
In fact, reports from 2012 stated that the oil refineries from Deepwater Horizon were still leaking, despite an official statement from 2010 that claimed the well was sealed. Number 27, the Oklahoma City bombing. This domestic terrorist attack shocked the nation. On April 19, 1995, anti-government white supremacists Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols detonated a truck full of explosives in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City.
In a blink, the sky dark with a plume of deep black smoke.
There was a tremendous explosion, a massive explosion at the federal building in the center of the city, the AP Murrah building.
We have a large column of smoke to be south of this address. Are you going to check on that?
The explosion killed 168 people and injured 680 others. The Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building was left in ruins, and the force of the blast damaged cars and buildings over a dozen blocks away. McVeigh and Nichols had sought to spark a revolution.
McVeigh became disaffected, latching onto a growing pro-gun, anti-government ideology that gained traction in the 1990s in the aftermath of federal law enforcement actions at Ruby Ridge, Idaho.
To this day, it is the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in United States history. Number 26, the Iran hostage crisis. In 1953, British and American intelligence agencies orchestrated a coup against democratically elected Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who had nationalized Iran's oil industry. With U.S. support, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi became Iran's true ruler.
The Shah's power is maintained by a vicious secret police and the fifth largest military on Earth, equipped with American weapons.
Fast forward to the Islamic Revolution of 1979, and the Shah, seen as a Western puppet, was overthrown, replaced with the theocratic government of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. In the middle of this revolution, militarized college students took 52 Americans hostage in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. For over a year, President Jimmy Carter sought to negotiate their return, but only after 444 days were they released, after a pledge from the U.S. not to intervene in Iranian affairs.
It was a long and harrowing ordeal for the hostages, their families, and indeed the entire nation. And it was an ordeal that plagued the presidency of Jimmy Carter, an ordeal whose final resolution eluded his presidency by less than an hour.
Number 25, the November 2015 Paris attacks. In January 2015, France was left reeling from an Islamic terrorist attack on satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo, in which 12 staff were killed.
The attack on Charlie Hebdo last week was Al-Qaeda's most high-profile operation in years. And today, they bragged about it. In a video, Al-Qaeda in Yemen claimed it targeted the magazine for insulting the Prophet Muhammad.
Several other smaller attacks occurred throughout the year. On November 13th, These culminated in by far the deadliest. That night, in a series of coordinated attacks, terrorists detonated explosive vests and opened fire in streets and public venues in Paris.
Only minutes later, gunmen opened fire on several bars and restaurants in eastern Paris.
3 gunmen stormed a concert at the Bataclan Theater, killing 90 people. In all, 130 lives were taken. The attacks sent shockwaves not only through France, but also reverberated around the world. Number 24, John Lennon is assassinated. It's safe to say that John Lennon is one of the most influential singer-songwriters of all time. Even after leaving the Beatles in 1969, he enjoyed enormous popularity and success. He also became well known for his activism.
Is there not a more positive way of demonstrating in favor of peace than sitting in bed with 3 square meals a day?
It's very positive.
However, on December 8, 1980, obsessive fan Mark David Chapman fatally shot him outside the Dakota Apartments in New York City. When news broke on ABC's Monday Night Football, fans were shocked and horrified. For many, the world seemed to stop turning.
An unspeakable tragedy confirmed to us by ABC News in New York City. John Lennon, outside of his apartment building on the west side of New York City, the most famous perhaps of all of the Beatles, shot twice in the back.
Around the globe, fans were united in mourning for a man whose music meant so much to so many. Number 23, Hurricane Katrina. This Category 5 hurricane was devastating not only due to its intensity, but also a failure of flood control systems and slow government response. On August 29, 2005, the hurricane made landfall in Louisiana.
It was quickly predicted to become a catastrophic event.
My fear is absolutely that the models are correct.
It is gaining strength again. It is now stalking the Gulf Coast.
It rapidly doubled in size and intensified into a Category 5 hurricane.
The storm surge breached New Orleans levees and flooded the city. Tens of thousands of residents had not evacuated. It didn't matter if you were from there. TV and radio audiences could feel the distress and panic in the air. Critics argued that race and class were factors in the slow local and federal response.
This story ends up being the roadmap, the instruction booklet, the how-to story of dealing with disaster. It also tells you what not to do.
The hurricane left an estimated 1,392 dead in its wake, making it one of the deadliest in U.S. history. Number 22, the fall of Saigon. Seeing photos of the fall of Saigon, you might be reminded of the more recent 2021 Kabul airlift in Afghanistan. Both involved scenes of panic and powerful images of last-minute evacuation.
The hardest part was the waiting. Many people said it was unnerving to be waiting for a ride to safety and to be hearing fighting all around you.
On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, marking the end of the deadly and divisive Vietnam War. The iconic photo of a helicopter evacuation from the roof of the U.S. Embassy symbolized the desperate and dramatic nature of the fall.
Yes, we've chosen to leave, but we've chosen to leave because it's no longer defendable with the resources that we have chosen to commit, and the limits that we have put on our involvement in South Vietnam.
In the aftermath, Vietnam was reunified under communist rule, and the U.S. began to significantly rethink its foreign policies. Number 21, the Jonestown Massacre. Founded in Indiana in 1954, Jim Jones's People's Temple preached a message nominally based on Christianity, socialism, and civil rights.
His driving force was less the Bible than social justice. He was very much ahead of the current climate in terms of race relations and his desire to create an integrated society.
But something very dark lurked under the surface. In the 1970s, Jones fled accusations of abuse and fake miracles to a remote settlement in Guyana. Over time, the charismatic leader became paranoid and obsessed with domination over his faithful. Further reports of abuse led to a fact-finding mission from U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan. He never returned, murdered by Jones's Red Brigade. Jones ordered his over 900 followers, a third of the minors, to take their own lives by drinking Flavor Aid laced with cyanide.
This time, Jones served a punch spiked with cyanide. More than 900 died.
The tragedy left the public in shock and horror, and is the origin of the expression drinking the Kool-Aid. Number 20, Nelson Mandela released. In 1964, South African revolutionary leader Nelson Mandela was sentenced to life imprisonment. 4 years, he had fought against apartheid, the system of racial segregation that privileged the country's white population and disenfranchised people of color. Even from prison, he remained committed to this cause, communicating with political leaders and gaining worldwide attention.
The fact that you could sit alone and think gave us a wonderful opportunity to change ourselves, your behavior.
As civil unrest grew, Mandela was finally released from prison in 1990, 27 years after he was sentenced. His release was broadcast around the world.
Heroic sacrifices have made it possible for me to be here today.
In a historic speech, he affirmed his commitment to peace, but also to the ongoing struggle against the violence of apartheid. Just 4 years later, he would go on to become the country's first black president. Number 19, the 2021 United States Capitol attack. On January 6, 2021, scenes of carnage in the U.S. Capitol, Washington, D.C., shocked Americans watching the riot unfold on TV. USA! USA! At a rally before the attack, outgoing President Donald Trump told supporters the election had been stolen and urged them to march to the Capitol building. Debunked by courts, state audits, and federal agencies, this claim was part of a campaign to overturn the election results and reinstall Trump as president.
This was a fraudulent election, but we can't play into the hands of these people.
Within hours, 2,000 angry Trump supporters broke into the Capitol building, assaulting police and searching for lawmakers gathered to formalize Joe Biden's victory. Among them were members of far-right militias and neo-fascist groups, some of them armed. The insurrection failed, with lawmakers racing to safety before the mob reached them. Number 18, the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. There were a lot of eyes on Cape Canaveral, Florida when Challenger finally launched on January 28, 1986. Due to technical issues and bad weather, the flight had been delayed multiple times.
Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
On launch day, CNN broadcast live nationwide coverage. NASA had organized for children to watch from schools to promote their Teacher in Space project, which had added teacher-turned-astronaut Krista McAuliffe to the crew. But viewers' hopes turned to horror as the shuttle disintegrated during its ascent, claiming the lives of all 7 crew members.
We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded.
The Challenger's final flight had lasted only 73 seconds. Number 17, the 1972 Summer Olympics. The 1972 Olympic Games in West Germany were the first to be held in the region since Nazi dictator Adolf Hitler used the event as a platform for propaganda in 1936. Sadly, the September Games would become even more infamous, etching out their own bleak mark in history. After infiltrating the Olympic Village, 8 armed men from the Palestinian terrorist group Black September killed 2 Israeli Olympic team members and took 9 more hostage.
The terrorists want hundreds of Palestinian prisoners released from Israeli jails. Nothing else will do.
After 2 grueling days of negotiation, the hostage crisis was brought to a violent end. The rescue attempt was botched, claiming the lives of all hostages and a police officer. Number 16, the O.J. Simpson murder trial verdict. It was the trial of the century, and the verdict left the public reeling.
Remember these words. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit.
After Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ron Goldman were stabbed to death in June 1994, Brown's ex-husband, former footballer and actor O.J. Simpson, became the prime suspect. Before her death, Brown had said that Simpson had abused and threatened to kill her. Every aspect of the case was highly publicized, from the car chase that saw him arrested to the lengthy trial. The coverage hooked viewers, and everyone had an opinion. On October 3, 1995, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant Orenthal James Simpson not guilty of the crime of murder.
For some, it was a vindication. To others, a travesty of justice, in which a celebrity had gotten away with murder. Number 15. The death of Osama bin Laden. In the wake of the September 11th attacks in 2001, U.S. President George W. Bush announced the beginning of a war on terror. The first stage of this war was the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan to hunt down Osama bin Laden and his terrorist group, Al-Qaeda.
In this conflict, America faces an enemy who has no regard for conventions of war or rules of morality.
This manhunt continued for almost a decade as bin Laden evaded capture. However, in 2011, the CIA tracked him down to a compound in Pakistan. In a helicopter raid codenamed Operation Neptune Spear on May 2nd, bin Laden was killed.
After a firefight, they killed Osama bin Laden and took custody of his body.
For those who vividly recalled the events of 9/11, President Obama's announcement that the Al-Qaeda leader was dead was a landmark event. Number 14. Russia's invasion of Ukraine. For months, the buildup of Russian forces along Ukraine's border had the world on edge. Would Russian President Vladimir Putin really give the order to invade? In 2014, Ukrainians had revolted against a pro-Moscow government, sick of corruption and abuse of power. Their success led Russia to annex Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula. In February 2022, Putin launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, furious at the country's aspiration to join NATO.
I consider it necessary to immediately recognize the independence and sovereignty of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics.
In response, the international community hit Russia with severe economic sanctions. Around the world, everyone's eyes have been glued to their screens, watching the outgunned Ukrainians hold off the invading forces.
If we don't stand up, we don't have a country to defend.
Number 13. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech may be remembered for just 4 words, but they are arguably among the most powerful ever spoken.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
The Baptist minister had chosen his profession because he felt sermons were, quote, a respectful force for ideas, even social protest. King oversaw the Montgomery bus boycott and became the leader of civil rights organization SCLC. In August 1963, he helped organize a march of 250,000 people to Washington, D.C. to peacefully protest for equal rights for African Americans.
With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood.
On the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, he told listeners that he dreamt of a world free of racism and oppression. His impassioned words were heard far and wide, becoming a defining moment in the civil rights movement. They remain iconic today.
Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California.
Number 12. The death of Diana, Princess of Wales. Although she was no longer Her Royal Highness in 1997, having lost her title after her divorce from Prince Charles, Diana remained a popular figure for the Commonwealth and beyond.
We interrupt this film to tell you we are getting reports that Diana, Princess of Wales, has been badly injured in a car crash in France.
Her sudden death in a car accident as she fled paparazzi occurred in the early hours of August 31st, while the British public were still asleep. Diana's driver, who had been intoxicated at the time, and Egyptian producer Dodi Fayed also died in the crash. When people in the UK woke and learned the news, the country was left shocked and in mourning. The death of the people's princess was felt around the world.
Goodbye, Rose. May you well grow in our hearts. You are the greatest place to serve.
Number 11. The fall of the Berlin Wall. After World War II, the Allies split Germany into East and West. The Soviet Union controlled the East, while the US, UK, and France controlled the West. Eventually, East and West became separate republics, but the flight of East Germans to the more affluent West prompted the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. Dividing friends and families, the wall became a symbol of the Iron Curtain separating Western Europe and the Soviet bloc. In the 1980s, however, massive protests and waves of refugees leaving East Germany led the government to relax rules for immigration. On the evening of November 9, 1989, East Germans gathered at the wall.
Elsewhere, they were swarming over the wall, hacking at it with hammers, picks and chisels, clawing at it with bare hands.
Rather than open fire, border guards stood down, and the world watched as Germany became one again. Number 10, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. JFK holds a unique place in political history. The World War II veteran was the President of the United States during the Cuban Missile Crisis and the commencement of the space race.
We go into space because whatever mankind must undertake, free men must fully share.
He was also the first Catholic president and was elected off the back of the first televised presidential debates. Yet, despite all of this, his time in office lasted less than 3 years before he was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas on November 22, 1963. Although the moment itself was caught on camera, the footage was not broadcast live. However, the breaking news was delivered to the American people as events transpired.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
The country went into mourning, and millions watched his funeral on television.
Now that he is relieved of the almost superhuman burden we imposed on him, may he rest in peace.
Number 9, the Chernobyl disaster. At first, the details of this disaster were shrouded in secrecy.
There has been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have admitted that it happened.
But word soon got out. During a safety test on April 26, 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant near Pripyat in Soviet Ukraine went into meltdown. The fault of design flaws and negligent operators. The subsequent explosion threw radioactive particles into the atmosphere. It was Sweden who alerted the world 2 days later, when radiation hundreds of miles away set off alarms.
The first word that something was seriously wrong came from this power plant in eastern Sweden, where workers coming on the job registered abnormally high levels of radiation on their bodies. Although the levels were not high enough to harm humans and no accident had occurred at that plant, it was shut down. And as tests were conducted, similar puzzling reports of high radiation came in from all over Scandinavia. But still, no accidents were reported, leading to the conclusion that the problem was elsewhere, to the east, in the Soviet Union. A fact confirmed to the Soviet people on television tonight.
As the truth was gradually revealed, the scale of the disaster became evident. The meltdown led directly to the deaths of 31 people, and to many more from radiation-induced cancer in the years afterwards. Number 8, the attack on Pearl Harbor. It might be known as the Second World War, but for the first few years, the U.S. waited out the conflict raging across Europe. That all changed on December 7, 1941, when Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Several ships were sunk, and 188 aircraft destroyed. Over 2,000 sailors were killed. It was a devastating blow to the United States Pacific Fleet. The following day, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered his famous Day of Infamy speech, and Congress declared war on Japan.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
The Allies' call for the U.S. to join the war had been answered. Number 7, the Hindenburg disaster. The first major disaster caught on camera. This airship accident transfixed and horrified audiences in the late 1930s. On May 6, 1937, the German airship LZ-129 Hindenburg was docking in New Jersey when it caught fire, resulting in 36 fatalities.
It bursts into flames. Get it started, get it started. It's fighting, and it's crashing. It's crashing terrible. Oh my, get out of the way, please. It's burning, bursting into flames, and it's falling on the mooring mast, and all the folks between it. This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, it's like 20 400 or 500 feet into the sky. And it's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the flame is crashing to the ground.
Watching the airship crash to the ground, radio journalist Herb Morrison summed it up best with his iconic exclamation.
All the humanity and all the fans just screaming around it. I told you, I can't even talk to people. There's friends around there. I can't talk, ladies and gentlemen. Honest, it's just laying there, massive smoking wreckage. And everybody can't hardly breathe and talk and screaming. Lady, I'm sorry. Honestly, I can hardly breathe. I'm going to step inside where I cannot see it. Charlie, that's terrible.
Despite the carnage, there were survivors, but they couldn't help establish the cause of the fire, which continues to be debated. Whatever the truth, the effect was the end of Zeppelins as a popular form of air travel. Number 6, Victory in Europe Day. After 6 bloody years of battle, the Second World War was finally over in Europe.
Today is Victory in Europe Day.
This was the moment we'd all been waiting for. Enormous crowds had gathered outside the House and all over the centre of London to hear the end of the war in Europe officially announced by the Prime Minister.
Berlin had fallen to the Soviet Union's Red Army, and Nazi leader Adolf Hitler had taken his own life. His successor, Admiral Karl Dönitz, authorized Germany's surrender. On May 8, 1945, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill announced victory over fascism, leading to parties on the street in celebration.
Long live the cause of freedom. God save the King.
After the Premier had repeated his announcement to the House of Commons, the Speaker led a procession of members, headed by Mr. Churchill and Mr. Greenwood, across to St. Margaret's for a victory Thanksgiving service.
Though the effects of the war were still being felt, the jubilation on that day is historic, and several countries still commemorate the date as a public holiday. Number 5, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Just 17 years after the Second World War ended, Cold War tensions between the US and Soviet Union almost triggered another one, this time nuclear.
Which you can all examine at your leisure, shows 3 successive photographic enlargements of another missile base.
In response to the US deploying nuclear missiles in Italy and Turkey, the Soviet Union did the same in Cuba in 1962. Cuba was keen for Soviet help after the U.S. had backed a failed invasion the previous year.
That a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
Despite being advised to launch an airstrike and invasion, President John F. Kennedy opted for a more diplomatic approach, a naval quarantine preventing delivery of more missiles.
All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
After tense talks, Kennedy and Soviet First Secretary Nikita Khrushchev agreed to scale back their nuclear missiles. But for just over 1 month, the world stood on the brink of nuclear catastrophe. Number 4, the Apollo 11 moon landing. It really was one giant leap for mankind. Back in the 1960s, the idea of sending people to the moon still seemed like science fiction.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower clear.
But, spurred on by the space race between the US and Soviet Union, NASA's Apollo lunar module Eagle touched down on the moon's surface on July 20th, 1969.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
Astronaut Neil Armstrong became the first person to walk on the moon, and Buzz Aldrin the second. An estimated 650 million Earthlings tuned in to witness the event on TV. Despite all our divisions, in that moment, the world watched together in awe as we achieved something we never thought possible.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful.
Number 3. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. While World War II ended in Europe on May 8, 1945, the Allies continued to fight against Japan. On August 6th, after the Japanese refused to surrender, the United States dropped an atomic bomb, known as Fat Man, on the Japanese city of Hiroshima.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
3 days later, they dropped a second, known as Little Boy, on Nagasaki. The bombs vaporized many in the blast radius and inflicted radiation burns and sickness on others, killing an estimated 129,000 to 226,000 people, mostly civilians. Japan surrendered on August 15th. Initially, the horrors of the attacks were little reported, but slowly, images and footage began to reveal the hellish consequences of atomic warfare.
It's important, I think, that we understand the misery and terror and death that it caused. If we were to be able to put all those stories together and present it to the world with the knowledge of the mistakes, I think that'll be a wonderful task to do.
Number 2, 9/11. Just about everyone who's old enough to remember it can tell you where they were when they heard about the September 11th attacks in 2001.
And we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know.
It blew up, a big explosion, people started running, it was just chaos everywhere. People jumping out, people just kept jumping and jumping and jumping.
For New York, it was morning when 2 hijacked passenger jets crashed into and ultimately demolished the Twin Towers as part of a coordinated attack.
Oh, there's another one. Another plane just hit. Right. Oh my God. Another plane has just hit. It hit another building. Flew right into the middle of it. Explosion. My God, it's right in the middle of the building.
Another plane hit the Pentagon. After news of a 4th crash came to light that day, it became apparent that the passengers of United Airlines Flight 93 took back their flight and downed the weaponized aircraft before it reached Washington, D.C.
You could hear him yelling, "In the cockpit, the cockpit."
They were chanting. Tom Burnett started at, "In the cockpit," and they were going, "In the cockpit, in the cockpit." They rattled the heck out of those guys in the front. They were terrified.
The event claimed close to 3,000 lives, and the world was forever changed.
The other trade center's down. It's down. It's down.
Number 1, the COVID-19 pandemic. On March 12, 2020, the World Health Organization announced that the COVID-19 outbreak had become a pandemic.
We have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic. Pandemic is not a word to use lightly or carelessly. It's a word that, if misused, can cause unreasonable fear or unjustified acceptance that the fight is over, leading to unnecessary suffering.
At the time, few of us fully understood what it would mean for our lives in the years to come. Nonetheless, the news had people worldwide glued to their screens or running to stock up on groceries, especially toilet paper.
To ensure compliance with the government's instruction to stay at home, we will immediately close all shops selling non-essential goods, including clothing and electronic stores, and other premises, including libraries, playgrounds and outdoor gyms and places of worship. We'll stop all gatherings of more than 2 people in public, excluding people you live with, and will stop all social events, including weddings, baptisms, and other ceremonies, but excluding funerals.
Through lockdowns, the world watched as the virus continued to dominate headlines, and the death toll skyrocketed from the hundreds into the thousands and then millions. The WHO's announcement was the beginning of a long, rocky road for all of us.
Boosters are important, but the most important thing we need to do is get more people vaccinated. The vast majority of Americans are doing the right thing. Over 77% of adults have gotten at least 1 shot. About 23% haven't gotten any shots. And that distinct minority is causing an awful lot of us, an awful lot of damage for the rest of the country.
All right, well, that's going to do it for this monumental look at all the things that made the world stand still. As always, thanks for watching. I've been Matt from WatchMojo, and I'll see you next time.